Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So welcome, Gerard. It's great to have you on the podcast show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we go into the meat of our conversation, I always like to ask my guests something about their origin story. So let me ask you, what did you study at university? Was it inevitable you would end up in intelligence and political analysis in the think tank world?
Certainly wasn't inevitable. I studied economics and philosophy as a double major, so two separate tracks. I graduated from college in 2008. I had gotten a job in New York City doing consulting. It was essentially market research for banks on the sell side in the bond market. It was fine, but then about 3 months into the job, there was a financial crisis. Lehman Brothers was one of the firm's clients. So it sort of went from the yacht cruises around Manhattan to, oh my God, we're getting a bridge loan just to stay afloat. So about a year into that, it was a combination of there being no other opportunities in New York at the time, and also the crisis itself affirming to me that I actually really liked economics. It wasn't just an academic pursuit, and just reading about what was happening in the global economy was fascinating to me. So I thought, okay, I actually did study this. So what can I do that would apply that? Banks and hedge funds were not hiring at the time. That was 2009. So I thought, okay, the U.S. government pretty much on a whim, I applied online for a position at CIA. I didn't know anyone at CIA or even anyone actually in the federal government. So I didn't know what I was really getting into. There was a series of events, one which was just pure luck of me meeting someone whose aunt happened to work in HR and it was able to sort of fix the log jam. So I eventually got an interview, went through the security process, got an offer. That whole thing took about a year. So I started at CIA in 2010 as an economic analyst. At the time, I was covering global economic issues, so things like the Eurozone crisis, or also tracking sovereign wealth funds. I did that for about 2-ish years, and then I covered South Asia for about 2 years to get into more political economy. And then in 2015, I was watching the obvious bubble in the Chinese stock market, and I thought, okay, it's time to cover China. So I switched over to work on China, and I've pretty much been focused on China since then, including I was at the National Intelligence Council for 3 years, so basically 2018 through early 2021. So the National Intelligence Council, for those who don't know, is sort of this coordinating body slash sort of strategic think tank atop of the intelligence community. And I was the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for economic issues, really just the China economics guy during the trade war. So that was
it's a kind of a technocratic role rather than a political role.
You're right. So it's not appointed. It's
okay.
It's an analytic role. It's not a policy role. So you support policymakers. This is true of CIA, by the way, as an analyst. So like State Department of Treasury, they make policy. CIA or the IC generally does not. They're doing the assessments that feed into policy. So your job is basically to call it as you see it, and focus on external issues, of course. That was an amazing experience. I wouldn't say a front row seat, but I was sort of at least in the theater during the trade war and the Trump administration. And then I returned to CIA after 3 years there, and because you could only do 3 years. And I was back on the line as a senior economic analyst covering China, and I loved it, but I just felt like I liked having more of a sort of open role. And so I figured I would switch to think tank world. And I've been now at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is for about a year. We are a nonprofit, national security oriented think tank based in Washington, D.C., where I am currently. I am a senior fellow in the economics program, and my current portfolio is quite broad. It's mostly China focused, but it includes sort of global macro financial issues to the extent we have to cover that, industrial policy, currency issues, sanctions, the emerging field of geoeconomics and what that even means, and various China-related issues. So it's been a busy time.
Great. And just as a side question, this is more at my personal interest. My knowledge of the CIA generally comes from the movies and TV shows. What's it like on the inside?
Well, so CIA is a big place. I was in what is now called the Directorate of Analysis, which is what it sounds like. That's where the analysts are. the thing that people typically think about is the Directorate of Operations, which does the human intelligence collection and covert operations. As an analyst, you actually do work with those people, but that was not my primary job. What's it like? It's like being an analyst at sort of a geopolitical risk firm, except your clients are the U.S. government pretty much exclusively, and you have access to what's called all source intelligence, meaning so not just open source, but human intelligence, signals intelligence, satellite imagery, et cetera, depending on what you're working on. And you're covering whatever it is that the White House, the executive branch cares about, answering their questions. It can be from sort of longer term strategic research, or more often quick turnaround taskings that go into the president's daily brief, which is the thing the president and the White House reads every morning. And you do a lot of briefings. I mean, so basically the core of the job is not all that different from what I'm doing now, which is to say it's writing and briefing.
Okay, great. Now you said your focus started to shift toward China back in 2015, and that was the point where China's economic miracle, so to speak, started to falter. After the global financial crisis, China seemed to be on the ascendancy, especially as the West economies were on the back foot. So, what's your general sort of sense of the path of China since 2015?
Well, in 2015, their issue was they had an overvalued exchange rate. They tried to do a technical adjustment, which did not go well, which triggered, by their standards, large depreciation of the RMB, and then rattled financial markets, which is my own personal drama covering that. The issue since has been they never really got off of the stimulus treadmill after the global financial crisis. So before 2008. It was never really exactly true that exports were what was driving China's growth, but it was sort of a second order impact. And they really were getting some benefits from net exports as a means of driving their growth before the crisis. After the crisis happened, they had to switch to basically internal infrastructure investment stimulus, not consumption stimulus. And that has led to a lingering set of issues with debts that are mostly local government and state-owned enterprise debts. Over time, it's natural that any economy would slow down just because of how the math works, right? They went from a breakneck pace for 20 years to now slowing down a fair amount. I think that there are a lot of issues. One of them is it just gets harder to develop the closer you get to the technological frontier and the closer you become to high income status. So China technically an upper middle income country, but it's close to upper income. They are running into, and this is more of an issue for the future, demographic issues. There's the sort of broad issue of slowing productivity growth. Of course, it's always hard to measure productivity. It's really a residual. There are different explanations of that. One of them is that the government, the Chinese Communist Party, really refused to do a lot of the reforms that people were expecting them to do after 2013 when Xi took power. And they really didn't let go of the state sector. In recent years, it's been more also sort of a merging of the state and the private sector to be consistent with government objectives or Communist Party objectives. Their previous growth model is running out of steam, and now since COVID, which is a whole other world, their big problem is they still have COVID lockdowns and they're dealing with a slowing real estate market, which we can talk about. But it's just not clear what the obvious growth driver is, even though they have said for a long time they have to switch to domestic consumption, not just investment. Investment tends to be state-led, or at least when it's stimulus mode. And the government hasn't taken the measures, the fiscal measures, the transfer mechanisms to actually support domestic consumption. I think that's one of their major problems.
And you mentioned there that there's been a shift in their policy towards kind of merging the interests of the state sector and the private sector together. Now, can you talk a bit more about that and what impact that's had on China?
Sure. So under Xi Jinping, we are now entering his third 5-year term as general secretary of the CCP. Early on, there was hope that he was going to implement reforms that more or less did not come to pass. I think the big miscommunication or maybe just deviation was he seemed to reaffirm the role of the state sector rather than downsizing it. In some senses, they have reformed SOEs, but I think the bigger issue is there's a clearer trend of top level design, as they call it, of providing guidance to the overall economy. It's not a state-run economy; it's mostly private sector, but the government does have a large hand in that. And really, from I'd say 2014 onward, there's been an increasingly heavy use of industrial policy to pursue mostly technological objectives, and it's just been distortionary. I think it's important though to try to differentiate what are structural factors versus cyclical factors, because in 2019, people weren't saying that the Chinese economy was in terrible shape. It looked pretty good, but there are obvious looming factors. Now it's been fashionable to talk about how they're in the doldrums, and they are, but it's really because of cyclical / COVID factors that at some point, I hope, are going to go away. And so they might go back to say 4 or 5% growth within a year or two. And at that time, then people will then say, oh, the China's model's back or whatever. But a lot of it isn't affected by people's ideological priors.
And on the zero COVID strategy, at the beginning of COVID, China was held up as the example of how to manage COVID. But since then, most of the world's reopened. They've used a vaccine-led strategy to allow the reopening. Why hasn't China done the same?
There's no good answer to this. They did very well after the initial outbreak of containing it. So in 2020 or 2021, friends in Beijing would send me images of them going out to bars and restaurants, which we weren't really doing that much here. I think one of the crucial problems is, for whatever reason, they failed to account for the emergence of variants. They seemed to act like it was going to be sort of a one-wave thing, even though we knew early on, or scientists would have told you, that there would have been variants. One sub-theme of a lot of this is that the Chinese government is not nearly as good at long-term planning as a lot of external observers think, and this is an example of that. They never really pushed vaccines in an aggressive way, and it was also true in Hong Kong. They never let in foreign mRNA vaccines. They have their own domestic vaccines, which seem to work, as far as we can tell, good enough in terms of preventing deaths, but are less effective in terms of stopping the spread. Although with later variants, this is also true for some of the mRNA vaccines. If your goal is zero COVID, which their goal is, the fact it doesn't stop the spread is a crucial problem. So they've taken to having basically what they call dynamic clearing. So localities are responsible for dealing with COVID in the areas using, you could say techno-authoritarian surveillance. I mean, you kind of need a smartphone with a QR code approval that you have green status to go anywhere at this point. It has been reasonably effective, but as there are new variants, as is happening right now, actually, it's been a stretch, and they have to do these aggressive lockdowns that are disrupting the economy. The exit strategy to me is not obvious because they haven't, even in recent months, have not pushed vaccines as far as I can tell. And they don't have a domestic mRNA vaccine right on the horizon, nor are there obvious therapeutics that are going to save them. So they really pushed themselves into a corner. And frankly, if you look at other economies that handle this better, I would say Singapore or Korea or Taiwan, they eventually, mostly this year, did open up. They did have some fatalities, but they were sort of ready because of vaccines, and they were able to put it in place. If you do sort of a loose analogy to what's happened in Taiwan, I think you could conservatively say China would have at least 1 million, if not well above that, deaths among the elderly. And that's in part because China has far worse medical infrastructure in the interior provinces than, say, Taiwan does. And so it's really a difficult position, but the government is still more or less sticking with the line that they're maintaining zero COVID.
And, one of the things I've been thinking about is, is part of the zero COVID strategy a mechanism or means for social control, to sort of stop social unrest and just have a way of just controlling society, or is that too kind of conspiratorial?
I would think it's more sort of symptomatic of their political system. So it's not that the goal was to engineer control, but clearly they have mechanisms that other countries have not done. Even say Taiwan and Korea, that were fairly aggressive at preventing the spread, did not go to the same degree in terms of aggressive lockdowns, and so coercing people or basically locking them in an IKEA or whenever there's an infection. I think it sort of allowed the party state is good at mass campaigns, and this is a mass campaign, so it sort of reflects their willingness to have those policies as opposed to being an objective per se.
Yeah, and in terms of the credibility of the government, I mean, is there a question around the competence of the party, with this zero COVID strategy, or do you think that that's not as much of a risk?
Those kind of questions are difficult because there is no alternative party. I think my sense, and there's basically no reliable polling in China, but the impression is that the Chinese population is generally supportive of measures to prevent COVID from running wild. I mean, they've been told with some truth that overseas there have been a lot of deaths and they've avoided that, which is true. But then there are cases like the Shanghai lockdowns in March this year where they were just so draconian, and a fairly elite population that thought it was immune to this kind of stuff realized they were not. And I think there are definitely areas where people are quite angry. But then again, Li Chang, who was the party secretary of Shanghai, is now number 2 in the Politburo standing committee and probably going to be the premier. So it hasn't stopped his promotion. I think in general, there's no real alternative. So the party's going to do what it thinks is necessary.
Yeah, and you mentioned the party congress recently where Li got promoted. I mean, what were some of your takeaways from the recent party congress?
Well, it's really a lesson that you have to be humble when trying to analyze Chinese elite politics, because as far as I know, very few people, if anyone, got it right. Macro Polo, which is the part of the Pulse Institute, had an online game basically where you were guessing who was going to be on the standing committee. And I think they said they had over 1,000 players and like only one person got close to being right. No one actually got it correctly. So that one, be humble, but two, what people's priors were was that they would sort of go the linear meritocratic promotion model. What ended up happening was she ran the board. He picked his people. I think it shattered any illusion of lingering collective leadership, which is the older mantra. It was pretty obvious to me and some of my peers in my previous life, at least going back to 2017, if not well before then, that she had consolidated power. So it was less surprising to me. But I think the general reaction from markets and foreign investors has been negative because I think they're just having to reckon with the degree of Xi's control. And there is some narrative, which I think is somewhat overblown, about him appointing incompetent people. And I don't think that's quite right. But it's very much Xi in command. And the theory, or sorry, the Xi delivered his political report as part of the party congress, and you can read it. It's about 65 pages in English, which I have done. And the key theme is national security, stability, and a sense that the global, the external environment is darkening. And so they're really prioritizing national security, especially technological self-sufficiency, but they're also not letting go of development in the broad sense.
Yeah. And then, it seemed to me when they talked about national security, they did also talk a lot about internal national security as well as external. That was the thing I found a bit surprising, the constant references to internal security as, within the national security construct.
The Chinese leadership, and I think Xi Jinping in particular, are, I think it's fair to say, paranoid about internal unrest. I mean, these are leaders, including Xi, who grew up during the Cultural Revolution. He was sent down country, as I say. He was the son of an elite, but then he nonetheless was forced into a rural farm and into poverty. His dad was purged, later brought back. But these are people that have seen chaos, and I think Xi is afraid that will happen again. I think he's probably a little too neurotic about it. I think people can adjust to things, and it's not just a country waiting to explode. But I think they are worried about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And then the other aspect of this is the whole technology story. It seems like China really is trying to double down, build up its own sort of tech hardware sector, semiconductors and so on, and become less reliant on foreign imports in those areas. What's your sense of how far advanced are they and what their ultimate goals are?
Well, I'll answer the second question first because that's easier. Really, since 2005, when they introduced the idea of indigenous innovation, is their goal has been to gradually replace foreign technology, at least core technologies like semiconductors, with indigenous, meaning not just made in China, but owned by Chinese firms with Chinese IP to the extent they can, as a means of essentially insulating themselves from external leverage. I also think the Communist Party has what I call a techno fetish when it comes to development. Their view of how you get rich is basically you own the technology or you control it, which is there's sort of some spillovers from that, but that's not really what economists would say. It's more about the diffusion and implementation of technology. That's not, productivity growth is not achieved just by owning it. You need to, most of the benefits of any new technology are not captured by the firm that is originating that technology. But nonetheless, I think they see it as sort of this elixir that will help them solve some of their developmental problems. In terms of how are they doing, it's complicated because it really depends on what industry you're talking about. And even then, say like semiconductors, there's so many different types of chips. It depends what you're referring to. My general sense is that if you went back and looked at the Made in China 25 targets that were announced around 2015, that they're falling short of most of those targets. There's a question of why. I mean, part of it is, they have been going very aggressive with industrial policies since about 2014, like I said. We actually, myself and some colleagues published a paper earlier this year called Red Ink. It's on the CSIS website, where we estimated the size of Chinese industrial policy spending in dollar and GDP terms and compared it to other major economies. And lo and behold, China spends far more than other economies. And we were being quite conservative with our methodology for China. So they're going hard. But it's sometimes throwing money at a problem is not the only way to fix it. And some of these technologies, like semiconductors, are maybe literally the most advanced thing on Earth. And so it's very difficult to get ahead there. And what you need is a lot of deep expertise, the human capital, et cetera, which they've tried to recruit from Taiwan and elsewhere, and they try to get the IP to the extent they can, but it's just really hard. And I think their key advantages are that China has a domestic market that if any country is large enough to attempt import substitution, it's maybe China or the US in theory. They also have the state more or less owns the financial sector, at least all the major banks. So they can allocate capital or absorb waste in a way that in a sort of more market-driven political economy could not. I mean, in general, I think that China's economy is market-oriented. Capital markets are kind of a gray area because of the state's role. And finally, there's the party-state apparatus, which can sort of direct resources with guidance, and also use SOEs and kind of use party committees as necessary to try to get private firms to work on their own priorities.
And then when it comes to the US, we bring the US into the picture. Obviously, recently there seems to be a bigger focus on the US to stop the growth of this sort of tech sector within China. But if you go further back, I mean, how do you say China or US policy towards China has evolved? Perhaps, I don't know how far back we want to go, but maybe to before the global financial crisis, Bush to onwards, Obama onwards.
Yeah, it's evolved quite a bit. I think you could go back to, say, the late 90s, just briefly, as we were debating in our country whether to grant permanent normal trade relations to China, which we eventually did in 2000, which set them up to join the WTO. At the time, there was hope that that would lead to economic liberalization, which it actually did to a fair degree early on, which then would lead to political liberalization, which did not happen at all. People like Bill Clinton were nuanced in how they said it, but if you go back and look at what people were saying at the time, which I've done, there clearly was a sort of naive hope that it would necessarily result in liberalization. 2008 and the financial crisis, I think, really it discredited the so-called neoliberal Western model in their eyes, because they blamed us for the crisis, and they pursued their own path after that, which they were doing to some degree before that, but it really accelerated it. The late Obama administration was clearly losing hope that China was going in the direction we were hoping. They were slowing on economic reforms. There were lingering issues with IP theft and other things. There was a more assertive foreign policy, like in the South China Sea. I think there was an anti-China turn happening within the U.S. system anyway. Trump accelerated into that turn, so it happened faster than it would have happened otherwise, but it would have happened anyway, I think. Around 2018, really when a trade war was starting, the Chinese government concluded, or Chinese leadership concluded, that we were really out to stunt their development. This wasn't just some negotiating tactic, which they had hoped at first with Trump. They had long expected that the United States, as the reigning hegemon, would ultimately try to stunt China's development. You could go back and Rush Doshi has a book called The Long Game, which documents, Communist Party documents going back 30 or 40 years with the U.S. as sort of the quiet fear the whole time. But the date when they expect that to happen was basically accelerated by a decade because of the deviation under Trump. And since then, they had hoped that under Biden, there would be a return to what they thought the Obama administration was. It has not been. It's been much more continuity, and in some ways more aggressive, like with export controls, only with a, albeit, greater emphasis on multilateralism. And so they're clearly, they were already pursuing indigenous innovation, but really around that time, around 2018, they thought, okay, the U.S. does really have to get us. And you see that reflected in the 14 5-year plan, which is the current one we're in from 2021 to 25. And it's really about self-sufficiency and building up control of entire supply chains as being top priorities. So they see it very much in a geopolitical lens.
And you mentioned the Chinese perceive the US as trying to severely contain them or to actually restrict China. I mean, do you think there's some truth in that? I mean, presumably the US looks at other challenges around the globe, and they look at China as probably the most plausible challenger to US dominance. So, I mean, is there a case that they're right? I mean, the US is trying to, trying to contain China.
They at least have some case. I think you could have argued, certainly, in recent years, U.S. policy is definitely not officially to decouple. It is not officially to stunt China's development. But I think the broad trend lines, particularly the recent semiconductor export controls, would one could be forgiven for thinking that the U.S. is at least attempting some types of partial decoupling, or at least limiting further coupling. The U.S. has been clear that we see China as a strategic, competitor and now maybe rival. That language has been shifting for the past five or so years. The Pentagon says that China, in particular, a Taiwan scenario, is the pace-setting challenge for the next decade. It's just very clear that the U.S. is concerned about China's not necessarily rise per se, but what they think they'll be doing with that rise, including military projection and securing some key technologies. And also, it's a bipartisan issue in the U.S. It's one of the few bipartisan issues. You can be anti-China now, and it's quite popular to be that way in Congress. I think the Biden administration is trying to be more careful, but Congress is Congress. They're going to be more aggressive about it. So, it's not a primary goal of the United States to stop China's rise, but there definitely are policies that are consistent with that worldview.
And in terms of the more recent export controls that the Biden administration has instituted, they do seem quite aggressive insofar as it seems like the US is essentially saying that they don't want China to, import any high-end chips, and anyone involved in the supply chain process where there's some US involvement in that, no one can do it. Third countries can't also engage in those exports to China. How aggressive is this?
The Commerce Department has some discretion as to how they grant waivers and how they decide to enforce this. So some of it is we'll wait and see, but on the face of it, it does seem quite aggressive. My colleague at CSIS, Greg Allen, who runs our AI project, is of the view that this will substantially stunt China's ability to develop high-end semiconductors for AI and supercomputing applications. That's above my understanding. I don't really have a firm opinion on it. But it does seem like the export controls themselves are more aggressive than what we've been doing before. I think fairly well thought out in most domains. They're pretty specific as to what some of those thresholds are, and having to work with allies to try to compel or coerce them to join this coalition. I think Jake Sullivan, an national security advisor, gave a speech in mid-September, which in retrospect, I think people realize is quite important, where he in essence said the old rules of just trying to stay one notch ahead or one generation ahead is not enough. We basically have to stay well ahead, more than two generations. And it's justified by concerns about what's called civil military or civ-mil fusion in China. So it's the idea that under official government policy, this is a big part of the 14 5-year plan, is that if the Chinese state deems that a technology is of military application, a Chinese firm more or less has to assist with that application. And so that becomes our justification for these export controls, which could apply to almost any high-end technology. A lot of stuff is dual use, right? So it's hard to see where the line is actually going to be drawn there. And in a sense, China shot itself in the foot because they broadcasted this policy so much, it sort of gave us the pretense, but that is where we are. And I think it's certainly, I don't see a slowing down in this regard.
And it does seem like the US wants other countries to also engage in this as well. I mean, how likely do you think is that the Europeans, for example, or the Japanese will join the US in this policy?
Well, within my sense with Japan is it's complicated, but Japan certainly shares the U.S. concerns about China's military and strategic intentions. My hunch is that the Japanese government is going to find a way of going along with the U.S. There'll probably be some compromise. In Europe, the Netherlands is the key country because they have ASML, which makes the lithography machines you need to make very high-end semiconductors. My impression is that while ASML obviously opposes this, the Dutch government is sympathetic to the U.S. security concerns. Korea is kind of a mixed bag. The Korean government is quite angry, actually, about the Inflation Reduction Act and how the green energy, the battery subsidies are not don't allow for Korean batteries. So there's some issues there, and they also have kind of a strategic straddling role with China and the U.S. So I don't think that all U.S. allies are going to be entirely on board, but I think over time the U.S. is making headway in that regard. And frankly, a lot of it is China sometimes helps the U.S. in the sense that it does things like its wolf warrior diplomacy, or it does things to alienate itself, even if it internally thinks its actions are justified, that are just gradually increasing the geopolitical concerns that will ultimately weigh into the arguments that Washington is making.
And one of the things that's come about in terms of how we talk about the US and China is whether this is a Cold War now, a new Cold War. I mean, it may just be an issue of semantics, but I mean, do you think that's not fair, but do you think that is a plausible characterization of what's going on between the US and China?
The problem with the Cold War analogy is it's based on one example, which is not all that analogous, right? Which is the Soviet Union was never a serious economic threat to the United States. Maybe in the 1950s, some people thought that, but after that, not really. It was not a major trading partner for the United States or the West. It was fairly isolated. China is the world's factory, right? It is deeply embedded into global supply chains. It has a large presence overseas in terms of investment and development lending. It's really much more integrated with the whatever the Western faction, whatever the other side of the Cold War is, in a way the Soviet Union was not. So it's not, you can't contain it in the same way because you're all part of the same system, and they've been integrated into the global economy. So I don't find the Cold War analogy all that useful, except insofar as you want to draw distinctions of what's different. But there is the analogous component of concerns about China's technological or military capabilities, and clearly being the U.S.'s strategic rival, which the Soviet Union was.
Yeah. And so in terms of how, I mean, this is hard to do, but how do you think the US-China relationship will unfold in the coming few years? It does seem like there was this expectation that Biden would walk back some of the more aggressive policy towards China that Trump had, but if anything, he's increased them. So the trend seems to be one of increasing, ratcheting up containment measures towards China. Meanwhile, China is doubling down on indigenous, technological development and more kind of, decoupling, you could say, from or reducing dependence on the rest of the world or the US. So it does seem like we are on a path to decoupling in some ways. I mean, but is that too, well, I don't know, too simplistic or?
I struggle to find reasons to be optimistic about U.S.-China relations. Clearly, we're on a downward trajectory. Relations are at a low point. You could debate how low. Some people will say it's the worst since really Nixon went to China in the early 70s when we resumed back channel negotiations with China. Even after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in '89, the George H.W. Bush administration still had a fairly friendly back channel dialogue with Chinese leaders. That's not happening now. I think neither side is inclined to seek some new compromise with the other. The political winds are clearly in a fairly hostile direction. I think the Biden administration is trying to be careful, but the broader U.S. political climate is still pushing further down that downward slope. I don't know what else is in the hopper in terms of the next rounds of export controls. There are clear signals that there will be more. But in a broad sense, I think at best we'll have periods of stabilization, but I don't see any meaningful chance for things getting better. In part because on the other side in China, they're quite paranoid about U.S. intentions with some justification, and they see this as sort of an inevitable type of confrontation and struggle. They have you could debate how much ideology matters, but it definitely matters to some degree. The CCP is a Marxist-Leninist party. There is sort of this Hegelian approach to history of having these natural cycles and inevitable trajectories, and I would take that at least somewhat seriously. And they believe that, as the U.S. as the reigning hegemon is going to try to stop them. Again, as I said, they thought this was going to happen eventually, just happening sooner than they were planning for. So I think we are on a dark path.
And in terms of the types of policies the US could institute going forward, I mean, one thing I've been thinking about is there something that could occur on the financial market side? So for example, delisting of Chinese companies, which already has been talked about, and there's a bigger review of that. But also just even further, I mean, could we see a scenario where US, fund management companies no longer invest in any Chinese assets, equities, bonds, and so on? I mean, could that be the next front on the financial market side?
Well, the two immediate fronts are, as you mentioned, the PCAOB's review of Chinese listed firms that are listed in the U.S., but there was an audit recently in Hong Kong. My sense is that went pretty well, but ultimately it's a political decision. It's for the PCAOB board to decide, and ultimately Congress has a major say in this. Congress is not joking. I think they are willing to delist all Chinese listed firms, including Alibaba, from U.S. exchanges if they don't basically comply to the T with the auditing disclosure requirements. I think, frankly, there's some people that just want to delist them anyway, because they say, why are we allowing Chinese firms to raise capital in U.S. markets? The other thing is the so-called outbound CFIUS. So the idea that you would do screening. So we already have CFIUS for inbound investment, where you have to declare certain types of transactions and they're subject to internal government review. But this would apply in the other direction, really just towards China. That has been discussed in the White House and in Congress for over a year. My sense is there might be an executive order soon that will address that. But I think that's the obvious next front.
And that type of investment, that's FDI type investment. So US companies sort of investing FDI factories or production facilities in China, or is that portfolio flows like buying bonds and equities?
So not 100% clear, probably FDI. There will be some threshold there, and it will probably apply to certain sectors in particular. My hunch is the US is not near banning just straight up portfolio investment into A shares or whatever. But I think we're on that trajectory. I think, could we enter a world where, US investors are just not buying Chinese onshore assets? Well, I mean, they aren't that exposed to begin with, and there has been a pretty substantial outflow this year because of macro reasons and geopolitical concerns. I think as US-China tensions get worse, and if the Chinese economy remains in bad shape, I think that financial delinking will sort of happen organically, but I don't think in the near term the U.S. government's going to straight up ban it.
And you mentioned earlier that there's this one of the few bipartisan policies is this containing China in different ways approach. But is there some nuance between the Republican position and the Democrat position? So for example, are the Republicans more likely to, push this financial delinking than the Democrats, or vice versa? I mean, is there some difference between the two, or is it, or is it pretty much the same types of things that are being discussed on both sides?
There probably are differences. I'm not sure how much they align with the party affiliation. I think part of the problem is, you say the Republicans, and I think, well, which ones? They're not in power right now. Yeah. Even if they take both houses, I mean, this recording on election day in the United States, they still won't have the White House, and so they won't be making all the policy. The Trump himself, when he was president, had a fairly different set of concerns with China and priorities than a lot of others in his own administration. Even the trade war had internally incoherent objectives, depending on who you spoke to in the administration. So it's not entirely clear. I think in general, there is a consensus, though, the worry about national security concerns. I don't see a lot of partisan deviation on that. It's more of just how hard do you want to be? What are your immediate priorities? How much do you care about other issues in a bilateral relationship, such as Xinjiang or human rights violations? How much do you care about supporting U.S. alliances, et cetera? I think those are the bigger differences.
Okay, no, that's great. Now, I did want to talk about some of the more military, conflicts that we often talk about in relation to China. The big one, of course, is Taiwan. I suppose we at MacRive, every year we put down like risks for the year ahead, black swan events, and every year Taiwan war with China, China war with Taiwan comes up as a risk. So I guess maybe I could frame it in this way. I mean, why hasn't China already, invaded and occupied Taiwan? I mean, what's stopping them from doing that?
Chinese leaders are aware that a attack on Taiwan, whether you're talking a blockade or a straight up invasion, would be enormously difficult and would be potentially a regime threatening event if it doesn't go well. It's one thing to, Putin took a gamble. It was obviously the wrong gamble. He completely misgauged how successful Russian forces would be over Ukraine. I don't think the Chinese will have that optimistic of an assumption. They generally assume the U.S. will intervene militarily, even though we are not actually a treaty ally with Taiwan, but they assume that is a high risk, which severely complicates it. On the particulars on the military side, there's also some issues like China not having, or the PLA not having enough so-called lift capacity, meaning the ability to move troops amphibiously across the Taiwan Strait. They have a large commercial fleet, though, so some people debate this, but they are clearly building the PLA's modernization is very much about both fighting the United States and Taiwan contingencies. So part of it is they're not ready yet. But part of it is the political leadership is not prepared to roll the dice on one big bet, so to speak. I think there's been a lot of talk over the past year of China planning an imminent attack on Taiwan. I don't think that's true. I do not think that Xi Jinping has a firm internal deadline. I think some of the commentary you've seen about the 2027 deadline is more about the development of military capabilities. It's not about saying we're going to go at that date. There would be indications if this were to happen. I wrote a commentary on this on the CSIS website about some of the economic indicators you might expect to see if China were preparing for immediate war. My former colleague / boss at the NIC, John Culver, wrote a similar piece on the military indicators. I think that's on the Carnegie Endowment website. And we're just not seeing those indicators yet. Actually, John Culver has this quote, which I've said like 15 times, others have said it, which is that for Xi Jinping, Taiwan is a crisis to be avoided, not an opportunity to be seized. And I think that's still correct. That said, it is also clear that Chinese leaders are committed to eventual reunification, as they call it, with Taiwan. My CSIS colleague Bonnie Lin put out a great piece in the most recent edition of the China Leadership Monitor that talks about this, looking about what Xi or Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin and others have said before then. And they're all fairly consistent. The timeline, such as it is 2049. We know that is the hard end date, because that's a centennial for the PRC. And to them, it's basically they have to end the civil war, which has not really ended in their view. Taiwan is still a rebellious province. I think that commitment is real. It's just a question of what that time frame is. I think that the question of Taiwan is probably the most dangerous and important geopolitical problem that the U.S. is facing or will face over the next decade or two. I think a key problem is that China's political strategy with Taiwan has failed. So the idea was an economic integration. So having say Taiwanese firms like Foxconn being in the mainland would then coerce the Taiwan elites to then want reunification. The economic side was more or less happened. The political side has not. It's very clear by polling, which does exist in Taiwan, that younger Taiwans do not want to reunify. They don't consider themselves to be Chinese. They consider themselves to be Taiwanese. It's its own thing. And those trend lines are not getting better. In a way, it's like China's strategy was sort of the inverse of what we were hoping with China, that like economic integration would drive the political outcomes you want, and it hasn't come to pass. So if you're projecting over the longer term, I don't really see how this gets resolved. I still think there is hope for deterrence, and I think that Chinese leaders aren't crazy. But it is a really intractable and dangerous strategic problem.
And your sense is the original approach China had, which was to kind of bring the economies close together and hope one of the parties would, somehow become pro-unification. I mean, could that be restarted? I mean, could that change? I mean, could they somehow subvert the domestic political parties and somehow, organically get, a turn in public opinion in China's favor?
I think so. That strategy had relied on the KMT, which is now one of two major parties in Taiwan. KMT is the Kuomintang party, so that's the old nationalist party that, in sort of the older lineage, wanted to reunify in the sense of take back the mainland, which of course no one thinks anymore. The problem is the DPP, the current party in power, has gotten more powerful over time. There will be elections in 2024. I think at the presidential level in Taiwan. The trend lines for the KMT do not look good. I think China's actions in Hong Kong really solidified some of the concerns that the younger population had in Taiwan about what reunification would mean politically. And even, China produces these white papers every 5 years or so on their strategy with Taiwan. And the recent one was saying things like there will be political re-education, et cetera. It looks, it's fairly bleak. There is always the potential for election interference that happens probably fairly routinely behind the scenes. In Taiwan, China's propaganda apparatus is much better with the Chinese diaspora, Chinese language media than it is with foreign medias. And that will be part of the strategy. I just don't think they're going to convince the young masses in Taiwan that they want to join the PRC, particularly given where political trend lines are going on the mainland.
Yeah. And in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how do you think, what lessons do you think the Chinese have taken from that?
A few things. One, they are definitely carefully studying it and particularly watching the Western reaction. My sense is that they were deeply concerned and surprised by the degree of Western cohesion in implementing sanctions, in particular the financial sanctions on the Russian central bank. That is something that if implemented on Chinese banks or the People's Bank of China, China would not really have any real workarounds to. They're definitely observing the degree of Western cohesion, whether they have the staying power. I mean, they might say, well, look, the war is still ongoing. We'll see how this turns out. They were certainly, I think, shocked, as a lot of people were, including in the West, at how badly the Russian military has done. I mean, this is an army that until fairly recently the PLA looked up to, that had some better weapon systems and that at least had some combat experience, whether in Chechnya or Georgia or elsewhere. And it's just done terribly. And also the Ukrainian military has done better than I think a lot of people were expecting. I don't think they would have had any illusions beforehand that the equivalent action on Taiwan would have been easy. So I don't think all that much has changed, but in that regard, but I think it really has highlighted that if these things go badly, it becomes all-consuming for your government and is a major economic risk. So I think it's my view is that what Beijing does with Taiwan is not going to be directly determined by the outcome in Ukraine. But I think insofar as the West can demonstrate both cohesion and willingness to endure costs, that will increase China's reluctance to take military actions against Taiwan.
Yeah. And then when you look ahead, say for the next 12 months, I mean, what are the types of things you're looking at to get a better sense of, the state of China, but also US-China relations? What are some of the sort of the key markers that you're keeping an eye on?
Well, the really big one in China is what's happening with COVID. There's various debates as to, or market hopes of reopening. I assume it's going to remain pretty much the way it is until at least the National People's Congress in March, maybe well beyond it. I've seen some people suggesting this will go into 2024. I don't really know. It's not clear to me that the Chinese government has an obvious exit strategy or metrics to get there. If you're a macro investor, that is probably the top of your list insofar as China is concerned. And it affects other things like commodity prices, because obviously China is a major swing demand, for a lot of things like oil. The other thing to watch is what's happening in the Chinese real estate sector. So the property sector in China, if you're factoring in all inputs and outputs, is something like 25% of GDP, or at least it had been. They're going through an unprecedented slowdown in the property sector. Part of that was policy induced because of their so-called three red lines policy. But it's definitely a major macro risk. and will be difficult to reverse. I mean, part of this is them wanting to stop real estate as being a speculative bubble in certain areas, which is understandable, but it's very hard to pop a bubble, or let's say gently deflate a bubble without it affecting the whole system. In terms of U.S.-China relations, I would see what the next batch of export controls will become. Look at what happens in our elections today, our time in the United States. I don't think that U.S.-China relations are going to get any better. I think there is more downside risk than upside risk. I don't expect China to do anything all that aggressive on that side. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about is whether China is going to retaliate for the recent export controls. I'm fairly sanguine on this. I think they'll have to do something. They probably will mess with some foreign or American firms in China. People will say, "Oh, well, China always retaliates." Well, no, it retaliates against small economies. It's much more careful with the United States than it is with, say, Lithuania or Australia. And in fact, China did not retaliate in any meaningful sense for the actions against Huawei, except maybe blocking the NXP Qualcomm merger and messing with some U.S. firms. But again, not nearly to the degree that we tried to mess with Huawei with the export controls. So they don't want to shoot themselves in the foot. And there are clear signals after the Party Congress that they're still trying to keep foreign investors interested, including having Chancellor Scholz come and they don't want to scare European or Korean firms out of China. So I think they're going to be fairly delicate with that.
Okay, that's great. Now, I did want to ask a couple of personal questions to round off this conversation. Now, one is more of a investing question. What's the best piece of investment advice you've ever received from anyone?
Well, I'm not a professional investor. I don't give investment advice. I have been told / have learned the hard way to don't try to outsmart or outtime the market. I don't have the time or aptitude to focus on that kind of thing. In general, my very boring but true advice is just buy and hold low cost index funds or ETFs. And I sometimes make sort of broad macro plays, but I'm pretty rarely picking individual names.
Okay, that's great. And we have a sizable young audience to the podcast and the Macro Hive work that we do. Is there any advice you'd give to people, students, as they leave university to enter the job market as they start their careers?
Now that I'm at a think tank, there are quite a few interns that cycle through for our program and others. So I find myself doing this quite often, which is sort of bizarre because in my head, I'm still 25. I'm their age, but that's actually not true. My advice is, as you're leaving, if you mean university, you mean undergrad, I would say put a premium on getting work experience rather than getting a grad degree. You can always go back to grad school, but work experience, I think, will give you new insights that you didn't have in college. Think of your career as it's totally fine if it's non-linear, as long as you're learning and having some cumulative takeaways from those experiences. The other thing, which is probably seems obvious when you're older, is that networking is really, really important in a way that it's not obviously so in college. Your network and your reputation can often be everything, particularly as you progress in your career, and you shouldn't trade your reputation for anything. And finally, for young people, just enjoy the ride. You have a career is a long time, and you have a lot of years to go and try different things.
Okay, that's great. And then another question I had more on the productivity side. You obviously have to deal with lots of information, social media, so on. There's lots of information everywhere and studies and so on. I mean, how do you manage the information overload?
I wish I had a better answer, and I would welcome your thoughts on this. It is information overload. I am a heavy user of Twitter in terms of figuring out what's going on. I read a ton of Substacks, but I subscribe to so many, it's become unmanageable. In previous years, a long time ago, there were RSS feeds that made it easier to track blogs. It is technically feasible with Substack, but then there's other stuff that is not on there. I generally, there are certain people you watch. You basically want people that can consolidate whatever issue it is you're covering. So say for China, I would highly recommend subscribing to Bill Bishop's newsletter. I think it's called, is it the Synology I think it's Synology. Anyway, he has a newsletter that gives you a roundup every day. There are other consulting firms that you can subscribe to for not all that much money, like Trivium which does great roundups of what's happening each day. So I read that stuff every single day. And then seeing what other people I follow sort of in the general econ or macro or sanction space are saying. But I wish I had a better way of managing the information flow. And I think there's just these disparate platforms that are not really consolidated in a useful way yet.
Yeah, no, I hear you on the RSS feeds, because I used to use RSS feeds a lot, but a lot of stuff you can't use as inputs to that. And then Substack obviously doesn't fit into that either. So yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
Now, last question I wanted to ask you was on books. Are there any sort of books that really influenced you?
I was trying to think about ones that are relevant for what we're talking about, as opposed to just books I like. In terms of government, or national security and decision making, the one I would highlight, which is a classic and many people have probably read it, which is The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, which is about the Vietnam War, particularly under the early LBJ administration, and how, what he called, ironically, the best and the brightest from the Kennedy administration were leading us astray down a stupid path in Vietnam. The smartest kids in the room, right, didn't know what they're doing, and they were able to fool themselves with metrics, including Robert McNamara, who, he had things like kill ratios or how much artillery we're using, and that must mean we're winning, but actually we were not. So beware of groupthink and self-delusion. I think that's a great example of that, at least in government. In terms of economics, I have read a lot of economic books. I wouldn't say that the economic books themselves matter to me as much as sort of various economists or thinkers. In terms of books, though, I would say economic history is where it's at. If I had to pick one, I would go with The Prize by Daniel Yergin, which is a history of oil, basically. I read that, I don't know, like 13 years ago or something, and it was a revelation to me of how much a single commodity could affect the decision making in capitals, like say in Japan and before attacking Pearl Harbor, or can affect the entire macro economy, like in the 1970s. Things that you assume are just sort of going well in commodity markets, sometimes there are breaks in those, which we've seen this year, that affects everything else. And I think that book does a fantastic job of showing that. And then finally, my other major was philosophy. And a philosopher I've been drawn to after college is Richard Rorty, who is the quintessential modern American pragmatist, which is a school of thought, which basically says that whatever is true is what is useful for us to achieve our mutually agreed upon ends, right? It's sort of a bit of a language game there. He has a bunch of books. His more accessible sort of political stuff is a book called Achieving Our Country. If you want the more accessible philosophical side, he has a book called Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, which may not be accessible to everyone, but he makes some points at it. I remember reading this, like, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago. I never studied him in college, but I was thinking, oh yeah, this is pretty much how politics work and what language really is. I don't agree with everything he says, but he has some very useful insights.
Okay, that's great. And now, if people wanted to follow you and your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I am on the CSIS website, but I'm also on Twitter. So I am at GDP1985. I'm also on LinkedIn, although I don't post nearly as much on that. So I would recommend following me on Twitter.
Okay, I'll include the links on the show notes. So with that, thanks a lot. I learned a lot during this conversation, and good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.